Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and dear audience of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada. On behalf of the team, I welcome you all to today's second webinar in the series that we sponsored and funded by Center for Defense and Security Network, and it's called Nature Triggered Emergencies and Role of Multi-Stakeholders. Our today's webinar is planned and designed to share with you the ethics and inclusion in nature-triggered domestic operations and emergency management. Today we have two distinguished speakers with us, Professor David Etkin and Lieutenant Commander Rosemary Park. Before I introduce our co-directors and the speakers, let me do the treaty recognition. Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada is located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homelands of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties made on these territories, and we are promise-bound to work together in the true spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Dear audience, without further ado, let me welcome our project co-directors, Professor Dr. Imdad Haq and Professor Nirupama Agrawal. Professor Dr. Imdad Haq, floor is yours, sir.
Hello. Good afternoon and good morning, those who are in the other parts of the world. Today we are having our second webinar with very interesting topic on the aspects of ethics and EDI. To introduce the topic, disasters and emergencies create a discontinuity in our everyday life. So it brings out a situation outside the normal state of affairs. So in that kind of condition, obviously, one big question is that how ethics are relevant. Well, obviously, as most of you know, that the humanitarian aspects that we Homo sapiens sapiens or human species to extend our hand when people are injured and vulnerable, even to die, this extension of our helping hands go all around the world. Even hostile countries send their people and so on. That comes from human ethics. But also the other aspects that in that abnormal situation we saw or we experienced is the role of the vested interests in terms of relief distribution, rehabilitation program, and many other vested interests. A good example is the relief operation of Banda Aceh after 2004 Indian tsunami. Most of the relief and donation did not reach to the victims. And that was an international event that affected 11 countries. So that's how the ethics from very micro scale to the macro scale to the global scale is very, very relevant. And today we'll be hearing from one of the authority on this topic who is very passionate about it, Professor David Etkin. So we are very eager to hear from him about his perspectives on this ethics in the context of disaster and emergencies. With regard to EDI, obviously everybody knows that our society suffer from systematic deprivation and exploitation of the poorer, disadvantaged people, or certain groups of people. Women, the poor, the indigenous people are obviously the common disadvantaged groups in society. Also, there are issue of cultural bias or subconscious bias. All these things lead to systematic deprivations, and they are deeply, deeply embedded in our society. So we'll be hearing about some of these aspects, that how are they relevant in the disaster context, from Rosemary Park. So I welcome you all, and this is one of the most important topic, and we are very eager to listen to two very eminent scholars in this field. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Kausar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Dear audience, let's welcome Dr. Nirupama Agrawal, and she's going to also talk about the topic and share her insights. Dr. Nirup, floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you. Just in the interest of time, I'll be very brief. It is my honor to welcome our two experts to share their perspectives on the two critical aspects of disaster management. And I feel especially privileged to draw attention to the inclusion of women and other underrepresented populations at every stage of disaster management, including adaptation, prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. So I'm sure you will agree with me that perceptions of decision makers matter in how they develop strategies around disaster preparedness and response based on many factors, including who the response is for and how it is going to be delivered. So, inclusion and ethical standards are paramount in that regard. And without further ado, let us hear what our speakers have to share with us today. Back to you, Kausar.
Thank you, Dr. Nirupama Agarwal. Thank you so much once again. The audience, we are going to listen intently from both the scholars and researchers in this area. First in line, let me welcome Professor David Etkin, and it is our privilege to read and introduce David with you. He is a professor of disaster emergency management at York University. Previously, he worked for Environment Canada from 1977 to 2005. During his career, he has been a weather forecaster in Nova Scotia and Ontario, taught meteorology to new forecasters, and done applied research in the Arctic and industrial climatology divisions of the Canadian Climate Centre. In 1993, David joined the Adaptation and Impact Research Group of the Meteorological Services of Canada, specializing in interdisciplinary study of natural hazards and disasters and climate change. From 1996 to 2005, he worked at the University of Toronto with the Institute for Environmental Studies, doing research on natural hazards and disasters. He has contributed to several national and international natural hazard projects, including the second US National Assessment of Natural Hazards, the IPCC. He was principal investigator of the Canadian National Assessment of Natural Hazards and is the past president of the Canadian Risk and Hazard Network. He has 90 publications, including two textbooks and six edited volumes. Dear audience, it is our privilege to present Professor David Etkin. Floor is yours, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. So I just have to get my PowerPoint up here. Slideshow. Getting. So I'm hoping everybody can see my PowerPoint now.
We can, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I did find this a challenging topic to discuss. And what I tried to do was to really understand, initially to understand the larger framing of it. So to begin with, there are broadly like different kinds of ethical perspectives. So there are a set of normative ethical theories, which are basically about how we ought to act. And then there's another set of ethics which are descriptive in nature, which talk about how we actually do act. And it's always interesting to compare the two of those. But I'm going to be focusing on the normative side of it, right, for this presentation, which is how we should be behaving. So broadly speaking, the main theories of relevance are the three bottom ones. There's utilitarianism, which is basically looking at the greatest good for the greatest number. There's deontological ethics, which is essentially looking at duties, obligations, rights, and so forth, following the rules of society, the ethical rules. And then there's virtue ethics, which focuses on people's character, uh, things like having, behaving with courage, being honest, and so forth. We have divine command theory and natural law theory, which are aspects of deontology, which can inform how people behave. So if you are a person of strong faith, then you say, well, we want to follow God's laws, and that's a part of deontology. And then there's another area as well called natural law theory, which looks at human nature, how we evolved, and attempts to understand how we should be behaving based on the nature of human beings. So we're talking about large-scale responses to natural disasters, and I'm not sure that it's that different actually from other kinds of disasters as well. But when you're dealing with a large-scale disaster or perhaps a catastrophe, you're in a different context than you are in normal times, and you have urgency, lack of information, insufficient resources, probably many stakeholders involved who may disagree with each other and have conflicting agendas, and a great deal of complexity. And which ethical theory is most relevant will vary depending upon the specific scenario you're looking at. So to begin with, if you look at virtue ethics, there's been a lot of work done on this, and it goes back thousands of years. So for example, the Greek philosopher Aristotle was one of the first proponents of virtue ethics. And there was a paper written recently in 2012 that concluded that the cardinal virtues of disaster response are prudence, courage, justice, stewardship, vigilance, resilience, self-effacing, charity, and communication. And of course, in any ethical discussion, people are going to have a variety of perspectives. But these are one set of virtues that are proposed in this paper called The Ethics of Disaster Management. And I have the reference there if anybody wants to look it up. If we think about the deontological aspect, um, this is about rights, duties, obligations. And certainly we can look at things like the duty to respond, but we do sometimes have ethical dilemmas that we run into. So while we have a duty to respond, we also have a duty to protect responders. And at times that can lead to an ethical conflict. And certainly individuals have rights, but also their rights to the community. And sometimes these conflict as well. And we saw this a lot in many countries during COVID, where people felt that public health measures were overreaching the rights that they should with respect to individuals. And so there was a lot of conflict about whether people, whether there should be masking mandates, whether vaccination should be mandatory. So this became a huge political issue in many countries. So we do have these notions of rights and duties, but some duties are stronger than other duties, and sometimes duties conflict with each other. And when you have these ethical dilemmas, then there's a question of how do you resolve it, which can be very complicated. Um, John Stuart Mill, or sorry, I have the wrong name there. So this should be Kant. So Kant is an example of a philosopher who talked about sort of the deontological aspects under utilitarianism, and that's a picture of John Stuart Mill. I apologize for getting those reversed. Utilitarianism is all about trying to achieve the most good for the most people. But this can also lead to difficult decisions. For example, different people might disagree on what is good. And sometimes when there's insufficient resources, as often happens during large-scale response, then you're left with the decision of, well, who do I help first? And triage is an example of trying to solve that. And sometimes some people have to sacrifice for others. And if somebody has to sacrifice, who should it be? And how should they be compensated if they are sacrificing? So Niru asked me to frame this in terms of inclusion. And inclusion is part of a broader category referred to as diversity, equity, and inclusion. Goes by the initials, the acronym DEI, and it's sort of become a catchphrase the past number of years. So I just wanted to briefly frame that. So if we start with diversity, that's in the bottom right-hand part of this Venn diagram. It's basically what Nero was talking about before, where everybody is represented, different nationalities, different racial groups, different cultural groups, different religious groups, and so forth. Equity in the bottom left corner refers to the fair treatment of people, and it is differentiated from equality. So there's a little graphic there just to demonstrate the difference between equality and equity. So equality means doing the same for everybody, like giving them the same amount, but people have different needs. And a basic principle in disaster management is that we follow the principle of equity and not equality, which is that we give people according to their need and not give people sort of equal amounts. So that's the equity part. And then there's inclusion at the top, which is creating an environment where everybody feels welcome, respected, and valued, and their voices are heard. And when you put these three things together, then you get that, what is referred to as belonging. And I think this could be framed within the broader moral principle of social justice. Um, and so I'll just talk briefly about social justice. And one definition of it is creating a fair and equitable division of resources, opportunity, and privileges in society. There's been a great deal written about social justice. And even if a bunch of people agree that we should have social justice, there isn't necessarily agreement on what social justice is, because different people have different concepts, for example, of what is fair. Some principles of social justice that are commonly discussed are: one, respecting human rights. And examples of documents that discuss human rights are the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and there are many others as well. Not to discriminate people against people on the basis of race, gender, religion, ethnicity, status, or age. Um, to allow to have access and participation of all groups and of all types of people. That there are responsibilities. So if people have rights, then from a principle of reciprocity, with that become there are obligations. Principle of equity, to each according to their need, not equal to all, which I discussed in the last slide. That we have just institutions and also procedural justice, and that conflicts are resolved peaceably and fairly. I just wanted to show you some examples of some of the many papers and documents that have been written about social justice and disasters. And I don't intend to go through all of these in any kind of detail. It's just sort of a display of a number of different examples of how disaster or social justice is so important. And the reason it's so important is because social justice is intimately tied to vulnerability, and the degree to which people suffer in disasters is very much a function of their vulnerability. So social justice and vulnerability theory are very closely entwined with each other. And just three more examples of justice issues in disaster recovery or natural disasters. So the Canadian Armed Forces does a number of things related to disaster response. For example, there's Operation Lentus, and they have three objectives, and this is basically focused on Canada to help provincial and territorial authorities, when they're faced with disasters, to respond quickly and effectively to crisis and stabilize the natural disaster situation. And they perform a large number of very practical functions, such as physical impact assessment, debris removal, sandbagging, assisting people affected by the floods, checking on the welfare of people, flood mitigation tasks, evacuating people, opening civilian roadways, snow removal, mopping up fires, transporting people, and delivering aid to remote communities, and helping law enforcement and provincial authorities. There's also a large number of the Canadian forces have also responded to a large number of international events, and the DART team is one. Don't have a slide for it, but it's one of the groups that provides, especially medical to support during international disasters. So, what are some of the ethical issues that are that arise during these kinds of large-scale responses? Well, certainly inclusion and diversity. So, if we're an essential component of a social justice approach is that everybody needs to be represented, because if people are not represented, their voices are missing, and you inevitably have social injustice as a result of that. So planning activities should certainly include the voices of those groups of people. And then there's the principle of to what degree you address equity. So assistance according to need. But again, there can be many questions like, how do you assess need? For example, some people are insured and some people are not insured, but they might have lost an equal amount. And if that case, do you take into account whether they have insurance or not? So that's an example of, just one of the difficulties of assessing need, and other issues such as moral hazard. When there are scarce resources, whether it's the number of responders, whether you're at a hospital and you're implementing triage, whether you're in a pandemic and there's a shortage of PPE or vaccines, under what are the principles used to allocate scarce resources? Is it first come, first serve? Um, are there some people who are more important than other people, and they should get resources first? Or do we have a greater duty to some groups of people than other people? Like you might say children and the elderly, there perhaps there's a greater duty to them. Or maybe there's a greater duty to the people involved in the response, like, for example, doctors and nurses during COVID, because they're taking on additional risks, perhaps or the military, for example, responders, should they get vaccinated first because they're acting in a way to help others? Issue of public versus private goods. So during a disaster, goods that are often public can become scarce resources and then transform into private goods. And this sometimes leads to things like price gouging. So as a society, how do we deal with that? The conflict between personal freedom versus the greater good. And I referred to that before, for example, which we saw during COVID. So when you are implementing, say, public health measures, or evacuating, to what extent does the government or do the military involved enforce actions that are considered to be good for everybody, but may be objectionable to some? Risk communication, there's often a tension between need to know and right to know. So a security perspective says we should restrict information because sometimes bad actors will get hold of it and use it against us. But a principle in emergency management tends to be more based on distributing information, and that people have a right to know what the risks are. And then there's the importance of being culturally appropriate. Um, and this relates to, like, especially in inclusion. So we need to respect people's religious beliefs, respect to food, accommodation, and so forth. There are various gender issues. And if you're going to evacuate people, they should be evacuated where possible to culturally appropriate venues. For example, if you're evacuating First Nations people due to a flood in northern Canada somewhere, it's best to evacuate them to other First Nations community where they would fit in. There are many barriers to social justice. I think we all know that social justice is not a perfect thing in our world or in any of our countries. And one of the main barriers is the process of othering. So the process of othering is saying somebody else is different than I am for whatever reason. This leads to exclusion and oppression. The process of othering is the opposite of inclusivity, and it's important to ask ourselves who our moral community is. To whom do we owe duties and obligations, just as a fundamental moral obligation? Where there is othering occurring, there's a lessening of a sense of duties, and discrimination occurs. Negative moral emotions that people just feel, things like prejudice, condemning and blaming those, perhaps saying, well, it's their own fault, they suffered this disaster, or feelings of disgust is another important barrier to social justice. And then there are ethical dilemmas where there are conflicting duties or outcomes, and you have to try and decide, what is a lesser harm or what is a greater good. And this can be enormously difficult and tends to be a function of values that people have. And given that there's such a wide variety of values, we inevitably end up with ethical dilemmas in society. And then there are various moral traps that people and organizations can fall into, and there are about over 40 of them that are listed. And just gave one example here, is faceless victims. When people become things, then they lose their sense of, we lose a sense of a moral obligation towards them. And I think this is one of the great challenges of modern society, where uh, where we are institutionalized to the point where we don't deal with people as people. We deal with people as just objects in a process that we're implementing. Then there are various social, political, and institutional structures that discriminate against various groups of people in many countries. Just one example of this, I know it's not the Canadian military, but I put it in here anyway. In Hurricane Katrina, which hit New Orleans back in 2005, on the left side, these are two stories, just represent unconscious bias. So in the left picture, there are two residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda. So they are Caucasian, they're white, and they're finding supplies, whereas the black person in the picture just to the right is looting a grocery store. But they were doing the same things. So even the language we use can lead to a process of othering and exclusion. And this can have very important consequences. So for example, in New Orleans, here's an example of the military, uh, you know, engaged in security activities. And so much effort was put into security activities that it really took away from search and rescue. And I have no doubt that many people perished just because that the police and military were involved in emphasizing security over saving lives, at times anyway. I do want to point out that there is a code of ethics and professional standards that has been recently uh, created for the emergency management professionals. It was from a FEMA working group. And in that document, there are 28 standards of conduct, and two of them specifically uh, emphasize, diversity inclusion, standard 1 and standard 3, and maybe there should be more. So standard 1 emphasizes that diversity is important, and we have to, standard 3, that we have to collaborate with all stakeholders. Engaging in an ethical analysis can be enormously difficult and complicated. And I just want to give you 3 intuitive tests that can be used to guide your moral decisions. The first one is called the pillow test. Would your decision allow you to sleep? The second one is called the child test. What would you tell your child to do? And finally, the third one is called the newspaper test. What would you want your decision to be in the public view? And if you answer those 3 questions, and if you're comfortable with all those, then you're probably on pretty solid moral ground. But if it keeps you up at night, or you would tell your child to do something different, or you wouldn't want other people to know what your decision was, then you're probably on shaky moral ground. I don't have time to go through this in detail, but there are decision-making processes where there are ethical dilemmas, and maybe sometime when there's more time, you can take a look at those. This is one taken from that code of conduct. And that's the end, and I'm open for questions, I guess, after the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I think such a wonderful presentation and a very holistic view of ethics and inclusion, and including the 3 tests that David mentioned for all of us. And I hope our audience would take it seriously and apply all these tests before they decide ethically for disaster management. The audience now is our privilege to welcome Lieutenant Commander Rosemary Park, and she is with Service Women Salute, and also she sits in Center for International CIDP at Queen's University. And I'm just would like to say that Center for International and Defense Policy, CIDP. So she has lots of experiences in her personal time with the military, and today we are expecting her to speak about Canadian Armed Forces, its involvement, and ethics and inclusion. So without further ado, Rosemary, the floor is yours, ma'am.
I'll unmute, and there we are. Good afternoon. So for some time zones, my topic I was asked to speak about was focusing on women veterans. I have other information I can talk about in terms of military women in general, but for today, the focus is on women veterans in Canada's local Canadian communities, and where are they in terms of Canadian emergency and disaster management. Just a quick fast facts. I served a long time ago for 20 years in the Canadian Forces as a regular force officer. It was a time where we were all, as individual women, breaking trail. I was often the first and alone in units. So it was a time where, when we talk about DEI, it would be one in which Canadian Forces actively resisted the legislation, human rights and equality rights legislation. That was in my time. Let us hope we have progressed. The research that I did do was predominantly around these issues of minority group inclusion in the military, how to find evidence that that the military didn't have to change. But that is not how you do good science. And we were able to have input as researchers to informing the senior leadership. Certainly, currently, I am now back with military issues, and since 2018 to now, I'm very actively involved in what are called external stakeholder consultations, and trying the organization interested to receive input from the external larger community. Upon retirement, I sought to find purpose, a sense of purpose that would match my military experience. And that led me into the nonprofit world, including founding a number of nonprofits, sitting on many, many boards, creating philanthropic funds, starting a community foundation. And then, as we move along, the emergence of social enterprise as an opportunity to provide support for Canadians. In this exercise, I am the founder of Servicewomen's Salute, which is acting as a proxy military association, since there has not been any collective representation of servicewomen or veterans since World War II. That's a gap, and this is something that we are now actively working to correct. My overview today is to look at the local community response capabilities across the requirements of disaster management. I give it a D. I will talk about the inclusion of Canada's natural disaster management. I also will give it a D. I'm going to talk about the inclusion of women veterans in civil society. That too gets a D mark. And then the last is the inclusion of women veterans in Canada's community disaster management, to be determined. We can do this. We can do this better. So, not to be suggesting a negative bias here, let me begin, but I think the eyes wide open in terms of what is the situation, what is the problem solving that is going on, and can we move from not just viewing this as a social justice issue, particularly relating to women in the military, but to their amazing capabilities, and what can we do with the skills and the knowledge and the combined experience of service women and women veterans to respond to natural triggered disaster. This is a quotation that I like to remind people that of the three sectors in terms of the economic sectors in Canada and broadly in civil in our society, that there is the presence of what is called civil society. And that is the informal creation of citizens coming together to solve their problems, which they cannot do themselves, but see that by working together, that a larger gain can occur for them and for the larger public good. the freely shared information, freely given time, talent, and treasure, formed associations, common spaces, common events, common action is a theoretical concept that was developed by James Coleman. He was one of the first writers about social capital. Robert Putnam is better known, but in the work I have done in my community development, I find his framework for how communities can strengthen and solve common problems very insightful in his first work, and in the work I've done, evidence-based. Just to give a context for the size of this larger sector, we have, if it isn't known, and I'm using stats from Imagine Canada last year, we have 170,000 incorporated nonprofits, charities, and foundations operating. And last year, they contributed, or the giving to the better good, the larger good, was 10.6 billion. These are not small amounts. The response capabilities in natural disasters is a special topic. It is not something that the nonprofit sector builds in to its mission. It is being performed by select nonprofits such as the Red Cross, St. John's Ambulance, but it is not cross-sectional in the nonprofit sector, nor is there a shared conversation. I'd even use the word conversation in terms of the public mandate and it's how it has built emergency management response. In particular, the shared authority. There is the nonprofit sector I would describe as the poor cousin, and information access very not shared, and resource coordination almost negligible, except for individual communities. What is underpinning much of this is the Good Samaritan planning. People will come and rise to the cause of the need of their neighbor and of their larger community. This was interestingly that it was mentioned by David, the Hurricane Katrina caught my interest. Paul Bourne at the Tamarack Institute in Kitchener, he said, as we are reading what is happening in Hurricane Katrina to the city of New Orleans citizens, could we do any better in Ontario? And that is what got my questioning and my examining and my asking, well, can we do better? The assumption is flawed. It was an assumption that Hurricane Katrina relied on, and it did not go well. The national examples today that I can give of where there is this lack of coordination are, for example, United Way Centraide 211. It is fully incorporated in the States with natural disasters and emergency response. It is not in Canada. They have Canada 211 is across the country, decided provincially how it will be maintained, and but it does not have a connection with larger public safety or embedded within the Canadian Civil Emergency Management Framework, as an example. Another example is volunteer centers across Canada. Similarly, not in their mandate, nor organized to deal with emergency disasters except in a reactive mode. Excuse me. Sorry, I don't have a mouse, so I have a thing. I have a mouse pad that's requiring me to manipulate. when we come to women veterans, I use this as an example, perhaps, of a proxy or a case study of what is happening in communities or has been happening in communities. What we see for veterans, women veterans, was when they were from the period of 1885 to 1968, you see they're actively engaged in civil society solutions, where they acted in a collective way to work with other military women to contribute their military experience. This largely ends in 1968 with the Unification Act of the merging of the three armed forces and the creation of the Canadian Forces, now called Canadian Armed Forces. We have multiple examples of the contribution that women as a massed group, as military associations, worked within civil society to assist adding their military experience. Formation of the Canadian Nursing Association, formation of the Canadian Physiotherapy Association, Occupational Therapy, Dietitian Association are some examples of where all hands were on deck and problem solvings directly are reflect the incorporating of women's military and in particular wartime experience. What we have today is some evidence that some women veterans are starting to act, but you see very, very small occasional examples. As an example, the picture of Lieutenant Colonel Shirley Robinson, a nurse, retired, who took action to say the equality of women in the military is unjust, unfair, causing harm. She was awarded the Persons Award by, in this case, former Governor General Ray Natition. We see monuments. I'm used to mousepad. We see foundations being created, charitable funds being created, monuments being created. What we do not see is a collective agency formed, other than Servicewomen's Salute and the class action lawsuit for sexual misconduct, which resulted in an $850 million award to individual servicewomen harmed as a result of their military service. We lack this ability. Here are examples of women veterans in Canada's third sector. The unknown participate. We do not know how many women veterans are living in Canada. I don't have a slide. I was looking for a slide I was looking to receive a slide that provides the Census 21 data. It hasn't been disaggregated to describe women veterans in detail, and the numbers don't entirely correspond with Veterans of Canada figures or DND figures. So I am looking forward to receiving that slide, but I was not able to put the slide up to describe the larger representation of servicewomen or women veterans. What we found in 2019 is an example of community services for military women. There were only 3 across Canada. So in a disaster, how can women veterans find information when there isn't information about them that can be customized so that they can see themselves in the community response? There are currently now 5 current nonprofits operating specifically for military women, but if you recall, there's 170,000 nonprofits and charities operating across Canada. There is no registered charity that is in existence, able to support this group. This group of women who have not done well in terms of their military service has high rates of homelessness, unemployment, lesser income compared to mental health difficulties compared to male veterans and compared to civilian men and women. They are a group in need. So, can we use civil society concepts today? Based on, we know that women veterans have performed well and acted and responded in coordination with other civilian women and the civil society to add their military experience to civil society problems. We do not have that example in terms of disaster management in particular, and this is the focus and the conversation that I started with NERDO, to say women veterans have been in national domestic emergencies. They have been on international deployment missions. They have the skills. We aren't tapping into that skill set with Canadian women veterans living across the Canada in all provinces. And how can we mobilize that skill set in terms of Canada's natural disaster response? That's my presentation. As I say, I am happy to share when I have the actual numbers provided me by Veterans Affairs research section to share with you, to give you an understanding of how many veterans are living in Canada. The estimate by Stats Can is there are approximately 97,000 men and women with regular force and reserve experience. There are an estimated by Stats Can 461,740. DND and CAF believe there are more. So I won't put that slide up yet, but it is a large component in Canada, and it is a large sort of resource in Canada, and it is not coordinated at this time.
Thank you very much, Commander Rosemary, for your well-rounded presentation. And the statistics that you shared with us today really speaks about our current picture of inclusion and diversity in natural disaster management. The audience, so we are just at the last part of our session today. We have heard Professor David Etkin and Commander Rosemary about their topics and how does it fit within the inclusion and diversity in nature triggered disaster management. Now we will head towards question and answer session as promised before, and we don't have much time left. Actually, I would say 7 to 8 minutes we can dedicate towards this session, and I would like to request our co-directors to kindly weigh in terms of question and answer, and if we are left with any more time, we will open up for the audience if they have any questions. So back to Professor Imdad and Professor Neeru for your question and answer session.
Thank you, Dr. Kausar. I just have a quick curiosity to Professor David Etkin. He very vividly illustrated that at times of, when real things are happening in a devastating or catastrophic way, the issue of individual rights versus community and collective rights obviously come into, face-to-face conflict. And Canadian society, we faced not only in disasters, COVID time, again and again. And because of these events, perspective moved to the more extremes in our society. So I'm wondering whether you could, give us some direction that how, rather than going in this divergence, how can we, what institutions can do to have more social consensus so that we have a more convergence to deal with this dilemma. It's over to you, Dave. You are muted. Sorry, you are muted.
Thank you.
Okay. I'd say thank you, Dad, except you gave me an impossible question to answer. It's almost the question of
Your thoughts,
the
your reflection.
century. Like in so many parts of the world, we're seeing forces of division as opposed to, people coming together, and political parties and sort of some tribal politics beginning to dominate. So how do you overcome that? Listening, empathy, uh, engaging with other people, and trying to understand the perspectives of other people are, necessary components of sort of a unifying process. Um, but how do you do that in the face of, alternate truths and a social media process that increased divisiveness? MDAT, uh, if I had the answer to that question, I think I'd be a lot wealthier and a lot more famous than I am right now.
Yeah, lots of EDI or DEI, talk going on at the academic level and also practice level. So, do you think all these things can make a difference, particularly for the new generations?
Oh, I absolutely think it makes a difference. It's almost like yin and yang. There's this eternal tension and battle between the forces that push and the forces that pull. And it's a wicked problem. So there will never be a perfect solution. There can only be incremental movements in one direction or another. But I think, like, to fight the good fight and to continue to push for social justice, and to fight against racism and social injustice is, I think that's the state that we're going to be perennially in, and what we do does make a difference.
Yeah, thank you. Canadian Armed Forces, I mean, we didn't have any opportunity to have a platform to engage like this type of dialogue. So, now with this Minds project, we at least have a platform to engage, between civil society organizations, as Rosemary elaborated, and Canadian Armed Forces. So, this mutual learning, I think, is an excellent opportunity to create some new grounds in these areas.
If I can comment on Rosemary's presentation, it was very insightful, something new we are learning every day. And I wonder, what's your take on finding a solution where veteran women can be part of this response with the CAF, and can we propose some sort of a unit which is civil, military, and right from the start, right from the planning stage, right from the drawing board, where veteran women will have a strong position to make decisions in terms of how to respond, who to respond to, and prepare for the future disasters and all.
Thanks, Nero. Nero, I was on the COVID-19 Veterans Affairs Ministers Working Group, where I asked, how is Veterans Affairs supporting men and women veterans during COVID? And we were, as a group, we were told, well, that's through the case manager. Well, the case manager is dealing with an individual veteran on disability that describes approximately 11% of the veteran population who are receiving disability benefits. So it does not describe the entire veteran strength in living across Canada. Similarly, women veterans are a small minority. They're about 16% of all veterans. What is interesting to notice is that with the work that was performed by women in the military, it tended to be in the support classifications. And so they were not, we were not permitted to go into the combat arms operations. And therefore, the use of their experiences in civil or in communities has more more similarities to jobs performed by civilians. So this actually is a positive that when they go into work in as civilians, they are going into the medical services, they're going into the health services. They have that ability to see the requirements that that can inform disaster management, not just in response, but in prevention all the way to recovery. So that's the plus for this cohort of women who have been trained and have that support function to be pivoting or turning that as an advantage. The issues of the nonprofit sector, it was clinging by its fingertips before COVID. And so if we are counting on the nonprofit sector to be able to be mobilized for emergencies, we're probably worse off now. And so can we take skill sets of women veterans as a new resource to bring them into the nonprofit response capability? And I would argue lead it with the skills that they have.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. They should lead it. And women in emergency management and veteran women, I think they will make an excellent group to be part of the solution to responding to these large scale emergencies.
It's the missing first responder category. When you have women in policing, women in customs, uniformed women in communities, the military veterans, and the deployment, particularly the deployment experiences that current women now have, is very large. So, missing opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Niru. Do you have any other questions?
No, thank you. No.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The audience, we are actually at the end of our session today. And before we let our speakers go, it is our privilege to summarize the insights of both the speakers. Professor David Etkin beautifully summarized his presentation by letting us know what does ethics means in disaster management. And also, I would say a very interesting three tests that is kind of stuck with me now: pillow test, newspaper test, and children test. I think Professor David, it is going to remain with me for some time. And through our platform, we are sharing these information with the policymakers, those who actually respond to disasters when asked for. Commander Rosemary mentioned about this untapped potential of women veterans, those we can always tap into and find a way to bring them into the decision-making process in disaster management response and also as first responders. And she has given us lots of statistics, and we do understand now it's such a huge pool of expert and skilled persons just waiting to be ushered into the theater of operations when disaster strikes. And these are the important aspects that we will take home from our today's webinar session. The audience, before I finally conclude and say goodbye, I would like to also invite you for our second workshop, which is going to take place on March 16th and 17th in Toronto, Royal Military Institute of Canada. And there we are going to discuss about nature-triggered emergency management who could or should respond. It is an important topic, and we would like to hear from you. And if you can drop in person, that would be lovely. And we would always welcome you and in this second workshop. So, with this bit of summary and invitation, let's call it a night. And once again, thank you so much, Professor David Atkin, for your presentation, and Commander Rosemary for your service to our nation, and also today's presentation. And we would love to work together in the future to bring these untapped potentials into actions. Thank you very much. Stay well. And those who are living near about Winnipeg, Manitoba, please stay warm, because we are going to witness more intense cold in the next couple of days. And thank you once again, dear audience. Stay well and see you again next time. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.